here. So thank you everyone for joining us today. This is awesome to see turnout like this. Hi. You're probably here because you have similar concerns that we do about the status of the stocks in the Columbia River and what's happening to salmon and steelhead and the declining runs and all of those different things. And while we might all be coming to this conversation with different opinions about that, I'm glad that you're here to join us for an open conversation with some of the biggest experts in this space. And so I hope that you're coming to our conversation today with an open mind and an opportunity to really learn from a lot of great people. Today, we're going to be talking pretty extensively about restoring the lower Snake River and what that would mean for the Columbia River and fishing opportunities, both recreationally and commercially and guiding and all of these different things. And so I am excited to have a really fruitful discussion about the opportunity that exists for us to really change the trajectory of what is happening for a lot of our salmon runs here in the Columbia River Basin. So I do want to mention our lovely partners. All events come together with partners, and so I'm glad to have people who really helped in this event. It's sponsored by us, Northwest Steelheaders. We are a angling advocacy and education group that represents recreational anglers throughout Oregon and Washington, and we have been around fighting for fisheries for about 60 years now. And our other giant partner that we want to give a huge thank you to is the National Wildlife Federation. This event would not be happening without them. And so thank you, Jacqueline and Zach and Keith. There are a lot of people from the National Wildlife Federation that made this event possible. So thank you. And then of course, our panelists. I'd be remiss if I wasn't thanking them as well. And we have an expert, great panel today lined up for you all. So I'll go through and kind of introduce each of them. We have Jack Glass with us tonight. Jack has been guiding fishing trips on the Columbia Basin since 1983. He's a longtime advocate for salmon and steelhead recovery and joins us today with over 40 years of experience on the river and over 20 years advocating for Snake River restoration specifically. So a wealth of knowledge on the river there. We also have Liz Hamilton joining us. She is served as the executive director of Northwest Sportfishing Industry Association since 1993, fighting at the local, state, and federal levels to protect the business interests that depend on fishing for their livelihoods, like our guides and tackle shops. She joins us with decades of experience working to recover abundant fisheries and protect the economic importance of our fishing heritage. So thank you, Liz and NSIA, for being here with us today. We also have Tucker Jones. Tucker directs ODFW's Ocean, Salmon, and Columbia River program. For the past 17 years, he has worked in a variety of fisheries positions at ODFW, ranging from pike minnow predation to Columbia River harvest allowances, and now he oversees the Columbia River program. He joins us today with a wealth of knowledge about the status of these stocks and the science behind different opportunities that we might have. So he is another great expert joining us. And last but not least, we have my boss, Chris Hager, the executive director of the Association of Northwest Steelheaders. Chris joined us about a year and a half ago after working in habitat restoration in the private sustainable fisheries sector. He's an avid angler and joins us with a wealth of knowledge about Oregon's recreational angling community. He's represented our interests on the Governor's Task Force for the Outdoors. He serves on the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Advisory Committee, and he serves on the Backcountry Hunter and Anglers Board. So a wealth of knowledge about what's going on in the recreational space of this conversation. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We're excited to have a great conversation. Each of our panelists will be taking about 5 minutes to address a specific piece of the conversation, whether it's from the science or the anecdotal stories or the recreational piece or the industry piece. And then we will take a Q&A at the end. And a number of folks have sent me questions in advance, and so I do have a couple prepared, but of course, feel free to use the chat function here in Zoom or the Q&A feature, or if you're joining us on Facebook, feel free to post in the comments on those different platforms as well. We have a couple of great folks, Alex Solomon and Tamsin Fleming, both at the Northwest Steelheaders, who are going to be helping us out managing all of that piece. So thank you again. And I guess we'll just dive in. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Jack. Maybe, Jack, you can tell us a bit about why you started guiding on the Columbia 40 years ago to get us started.
Thank you, Betsy, and thanks for all that's attending. My name is Jack Glass. I'm a full-time fishing guide. As Betsy mentioned, I started in 1983 on the Columbia River. I live in Troutdale, right next to the Columbia. I'm literally a mile and a half from the Columbia by way of the Sandy River. I live on the banks of the Sandy River, and I travel in and out of the Columbia on a regular basis. I was in the Columbia today, as a matter of fact. So I've always monitored the Columbia River closely. I've turned it into my passion to follow these waterways and the various fisheries. But in 1982, the Columbia River opened to where you could harvest steelhead. The steelhead trout was a magnificent fish, widely reached all the way up into Snake River, Clearwater rivers in Idaho. These are a magnificent fish that make that kind of a journey. It was closed for 7 years. In 1982, they started a hatchery program prior to that, so they opened it up for some steelhead harvest. In those days, they started the fin clipping program of the adipose fin, and so they decided that we could start harvesting those as long as the dorsal fin was taller than 2 inches. Well, it takes 5 years to integrate an adipose fin clipping program. It takes a while to get the hatchery juveniles released and the clipping and everything involved before it's 100% inactive. So we had to let them go if the dorsal fin was taller than 2 inches. Well, quite often, because they were all wilds back in those days, those Idaho fish especially were, a lot of them were dorsal fin was way over 2 inches. I've seen steelhead in the 30-pound class back in those days. They were a magnificent, huge fish. So we let those go and we're able to harvest the smaller fin clip fish after that was going. And so I thought, well, I'm gonna do this guiding thing. They're fairly easy to catch at that time. They were starting to rebound. The tribes got involved with various lawsuits with the federal government and power companies to provide hatchery programs to continue those stocks of fish, because they have treaty rights to harvest fish out of the Columbia River. So then I recall 2001, the Columbia River reopened to harvesting Columbia River spring Chinook and summer Chinook. Those fisheries were closed for 27 years. 27 years, you could not harvest any of those fish because they were all wilds. So there again, went back into integrating some hatchery programs with a fin clipping program. And so when we could identify those, we could keep the hatchery ones and let the wild ones go. So this provided tribal necessity to harvest their fish because wilds were declining so much, we had to protect those. So this was kind of a fix. It kind of helped a little bit, and it spurred a number of fishing activities that started going. The fall fishery on fall Chinook, which is a different run of fish or later, have been able to kind of maintain up and down, very cyclical reaction to environment conditions and spill. In 2000, I went back to Capitol Hill and representing Columbia River salmon fishing and the needs for the sports industry as a whole to having salmon, a stable salmon fishery and the industry that it drives with not only sports anglers, but there's people that build the boats, the people that build the rods, the manufacturers of products, gas stations, you name it, everything involved with this fishery was vital. It's an industry. It's just as important as anything else. So at the time, there was a lot of talk about removing of Snake River dams. This is 2000. I actually went twice. I went 2000 and 2002 with some others, and we met with our state senators of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, talking to them about how important it was that we have this resource. Well, and then I can recall that also at that time, I'm thinking, well, we're never going to remove Snake River dams. That was the big component. We're talking about removing Snake River dams to help the Idaho fish back into the Snake River systems and Clearwater system. And I'm thinking that's never going to happen. We're going to remove these Snake River dams, but at least give us spill. please give us spills so we can wash those juveniles downstream, because they made attempts at moving them in barges. They made attempts at moving them in trucks, the juvenile fish. Well, that's not a natural way for those fish to migrate downriver. So spill was an alternative. So, and to saving grace of Judge Redden, I believe it's around 2005, he mandated a certain amount of spill over those dams to pass fish. So that was a huge, huge benefit. And we're glad to see that happen. But it only kind of highlighted a few times where it actually brought in more fish. It was not the saving grace. It was not the final straw to give us substantial, sustainable returns of fish. So I do recall also in those days that people were also campaigning to legalize marijuana. And I thought, oh, that'll never happen. We'll never legalize marijuana. Well, here we are 20 some years later. Look what's happened. I see in the future Snake River dams to be managed, or I'm not going to say removed, they're going to be incorporated a way that we can pass the fish in a more natural passage. Does they actually remove them or just make water flow by the side of it? I don't know, but I know that we need help with Snake River fisheries to rebound back to what we could have. We tried a lot of different things and it's not working. We've got to come to something that's reliable to protect those natural wild stocks that are going back to Idaho. And more than that, yeah. I got a minute?
Yeah.
I can go on and on about fisheries. I depend on it. My son's a full-time fishing guide. He started 2005. And we've been at this for some time, and it's a viable resource to all in the Northwest to enjoy salmon fishing in the Columbia River. It is the bloodline of the Pacific Northwest is salmon in the Columbia River.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jack. Thanks for walking us through some of that history. It definitely has been an ongoing campaign. Well, and that really sets us up well for Tucker. So Tucker, maybe you can kind of elaborate on some of this science that really is about the declines and where those are coming from and what's contributing to them.
Thanks, Betsy, and thanks, Jack, too. Just, interesting sidebar. I was 10 years old when Jack started guiding, so that's a while, Jack. Congratulations. I'm glad you're still at it, man. Yep. Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about, as you said, the science around the fish and what's going on. I think Jack did hit on, one key thing when he mentioned spill, right? These fish have been depressed for a long, long time. We have been fighting for a long, long time. Organizations like your own, like the National Wildlife Federation, there's Oregon. Then of course we've been fighting for these fish for a long time. And spill has been an important component of keeping these fish and these fisheries viable. But on its own, what we're starting to see, the science is really starting to become clear that on its own spill, while it will help protect them and it will help bolster runs, and it sort of lowers, it raises the floor in not great times. It's not enough, right? And so I guess, science and clarity is kind of what I'm hoping to talk to folks tonight about. So you're going to hear me say that theme quite a bit, right? The science is clear on a lot of things right now. The science is clear that dams on the lower Snake River and the lower Columbia River are one of the major causes of the decline and really the biggest sort of current source of direct mortality for these listed salmon and steelhead from the Snake Basin. And I'm sure there are other sources of immediate mortality, fisheries, predation, etc. But relatively speaking, these other things have a much smaller impact than the dams. The science is also clear that these fish have been persisting at a very low level for decades. And when you are there at that level for so long, you're really just one sort of catastrophic event away from extinction, from going away. These populations, so a lot of these populations, they've been at risk, and just because they haven't, thank God, knock on wood, winked out on our watch, it doesn't mean that they're not, at risk. You can't have these sort of low levels for a long time and not expect sort of, bad things if you're not careful. The science is clear that, that risk is, going to grow each year as the climate change predictions are becoming climate change realities. The science is clear that, while a big driver of returns, there's been a lot of, I think, coverage lately on ocean conditions, or maybe just I'm paying attention to that, but there's been a lot of press or other things about how really oceans are they're the only thing that matters, right? And when the oceans are bad, then all salmon are bad. And when the oceans are good, all salmon are good. Sure, the ocean it's clearly a big driver for returns, but they're not the only driver. Not to, keep coming back to the same thing, but the science, helps us see this too. We can take an example, within our region. We can look at spring Chinook salmon from the John Day River in northeast Oregon, right near where I grew up. Those fish, they continue to return at much higher rates than the spring Chinook from the Snake River Basin. This is despite facing the same fisheries, the same predation pressures, and the same ocean conditions. Really the one difference is that the Snake River fish have to go past 8 dams, and the John Day fish only have to go past 3. So ultimately, not even the best ocean conditions can resurrect a dead fish. We have to, I think, start thinking about ways to minimize the impact from those dams. So yeah, lots of science, lots going on, lots knowing us kind of what's going on, but there is a solution, as the governor Brown said in her letter to Washington's Governor Inslee. Again, the science is clear. The best and most robust chance we have for recovering those listed stocks is the restoration of the lower Snake River, having that sort of free-flowing Snake River where fish aren't having to go through those powerhouses. This is science that, just so everybody knows, has also been confirmed by federal scientists from NOAA in their recent EIS analysis. There's a real convergence here. Everyone acknowledges that the best and most certain chance we have of recovering these fish is restoring that river. As I mentioned earlier, Oregon has been a leader on this for decades. Not quite as long as Jack's been guiding, but nearly so. And fighting for salmon and for fisheries in the courts and on the ground in the streams, in the rivers, everywhere we can, we're looking to increase protection for these fish. And that's because the fish and the fisheries that come with them, they are a conservation opportunity also. Having you folks engaged and interested and caring is part of what makes the conservation fight work. In Oregon, we continue and will continue to, support salmon recovery in whatever venues are necessary, and continue to look for collaborative solutions that will recover salmon and make, strategic investments in the region. I think there has been a lot of sort of, I don't know what the right way to describe it, sort of creating false adversaries in this fight. It has to be salmon at the expense of farmers or, people shipping commodities on the river. And that's, I think, really a false narrative. Right? I mean, Oregon, and I don't think anybody who lives, really most Pacific Northwesterners, we're not looking, for fish recovery at the expense of other sectors of the regional economy. but really for decades, salmon and steelhead have been left out of that regional economy. So what we're looking is for solutions that include robust returns for salmon and fisheries with robust improvements in the regional economy.
Exactly.
So, I mean, just sort of wrapping up, I guess the science is clear on this. Salmon are important. They're an important, really incredibly important to the Pacific Northwest identity. And if we don't do something soon, in my professional opinion, we risk not only a huge economic and ecological cost, we also risk losing, like part of our identity and, a key piece and connection to the outdoors that I think really, is important to certainly myself and my family, but almost every Northwesterner I meet and know.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Tucker. Thank you for putting the runs kind of in context of what the science is saying. And maybe, Chris, you can kind of build on that. I mean, Tucker did a great job like linking this to what it means to be a Northwesterner in a lot of ways. And I would bet that a lot of the folks on the line also fish and share a love for fishing. And so maybe you can kind of talk about what restoring a Snake River would mean for our recreational angling community.
Yeah, thanks, Betsy, and thanks everybody for being here, Jack, Tucker, Liz, and a big hand to Betsy and Jacqueline and the rest of the team that really put this together. Really appreciate that. Just to kind of point out, what this really means for the recreational community, it puts us in a position where we're at risk for a lot of things, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we usually don't talk about within this campaign is what happens downriver and what that means for recreational anglers here in the lower Columbia. When you think about the snake and historic runs, the snake produced 50% of Chinook salmon for the Columbia River Basin. At the highest of highs, it was close to approximately 8 million fish. And when you look at today, when we have a buoy 10 opener, and we're filling a quota within 2 days, it's a stark contrast between what it could be and what it is right now. And the 4 Snake River dams really play a huge part in that. If we want to, or I guess what it means to really recover and recover the area and recover that key habitat for spawning and for rearing salmon and steelhead, we're talking about the recovery of an increase of harvest. We're talking about the increase of longer fishing seasons, increase in economy, which Liz will, I'm assuming we'll talk to, so I won't talk too much about that. But there's just a lot at stake. And if we don't act right now, we're really risking to lose all of that, like Tucker was saying. And a huge part of that too is I want to be able to, fish for salmon and steelhead in the Columbia with my grandkids one day. And right now, if we don't move towards what the science is telling us, that might not be a reality. And that's huge. That's huge for, just like to reiterate and echo Tucker, it's a part of the Pacific Northwest identity. It's a part of our fishing heritage. It's part of, everybody that's wedded the line in the Columbia or its tributaries. So yeah, I mean, that's basically what we're looking at right now.
I'm trying to unmute myself. Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you for elaborating on what the huge benefit that restoring this river would mean for our recreational community. I mean, just thinking about, how much more fish there are in the river, it just increases the opportunity that much. So thank you. And Liz, maybe you can kind of hit it home and paint the picture of what Snake River restoration means for our economy and what the opportunity is that we might be able to take advantage of.
Well, before I dive in, I'm going to start by asking the folks who are here with us today, and thank you all for being here, a question. I would ask you, how did you like fishing for spring Chinook back in 2001? I mean, do you remember the saying that you couldn't buy a bag of chips west of Bonneville? I mean, we were like locusts descending on all the stores. The economic activity that went around with that fishery was just amazing. Can you picture having that consistently? Because I think we all would. You know, our society has spent over $17 billion trying, but as Tucker pointed out, we don't have a lot to show for this, and our stocks, many of them are still at risk of extinction. This fishery that lasted all the way through April had nearly 200,000 angler trips tied up below Bonneville. Today, talking about economics, it's a handful of days in April and maybe 75,000 angler trips. I mean, it's been a disaster for the sport fishing community and the tribes and the commercial fishers as well. I mean, we're going in the wrong direction. We're circling the drain, and we're harming a $3 billion Northwest sport fishing industry that serves about 400,000 of you that buy a license to fish for salmon and steelhead in the Columbia and Oregon and Washington. But sport fishing really isn't just about an economic engine. For most of us, it's a birthright. And beyond that, you know, your licenses, our licenses and fees, and the excise tax that our industry pays are funding source for conservation. And together we are a mighty force for conservation. The sport fishing business community and our customers, though, are pretty conservative by nature, but maybe that's why so many of us embrace the efforts to restore the lower Snake River Basin, if we can build a comprehensive solution that supports others who also rely on the river, because it's cost effective and it will double. Can you hear me? Double and sometimes triple the smolt to adult returns in the river. Double, sometimes triple the number of hatchery and wild spring Chinook and bee-run steelhead back to the Snake Basin if we can build this comprehensive solution. And it'll also benefit other stocks that migrate through the hydrosystem corridor. But you heard a little bit earlier, there's those who have fought for years to keep the status quo by feeding us with these false choices. And I think we're done with those false choices, right? We're done with the us versus them. We're done with fish versus irrigation or fish versus energy. We can modernize this system in a way that creates irrigation solutions for farmers. We can replace the power from the snake dams with clean and renewable energy. And hey, how about conservation? We can upgrade rail, road, and port transportation, revitalize waterfronts, and also include money for dam removal. But to engage in this mighty lift, we need the voices of these 400,000 anglers that fish in the river and who care about the future that we leave for our children and our grandchildren. So we have to be ready to put our differences aside and work together, and we need to seek a congressional action and a comprehensive legislative infrastructure package that protects and creates jobs and restores salmon and steelhead. So you've seen a petition you can sign on to. You know how to find your legislators. If not, you call any of us and we will help you. And let's let them know that this is what we need from them. This is our moment, and we need to grab it.
Oh, thank you so much, Liz, for hitting us home with that opportunity, that hope. And yes, we are at an opportunity where we really can change things. And this is the moment that we kind of have to. The runs are telling us that if, just as Tucker said, you know, some of these runs are at a point where they can't withstand one more catastrophic kind of event, whether that's a big drought year or a low water. I guess that would be the same thing, but either way, like we know that some of these runs are extremely at risk, and so we know that a lot of these fish that are being born and spawned in Idaho are not making it back, and we know that we have to do something. And so if we want to save fishing, if we want to save this huge economic driver that Liz just spoke to, if we want to save the small businesses that folks like Jack Glass work at, I mean, this is what it means to be a Northwesterner. And so we can only change this, though, with the help of all of you. And you all are here, and we are so glad that now you have some little tidbits about this piece, and you can share that with your networks, and you can also use that to really talk to your legislators. I mean, the only way that we can change this is with conversations with our legislators. The reality is those dams are federally owned, and the federal government is the only entity that can really make a lasting decision about them. And so we've put a number of different things in the chat in terms of action alerts, whether it's through the NWF. They have a number of phone call opportunities too. You can sign our petition and stay engaged in our campaign. And so I just hope that all of you will find a way to hold this message with you, because 2021 is a year that we really need to make movement on this. And there's been a number of great questions coming in through the chat, and a lot of great questions were sent to me in advance of this meeting. And I really want to make sure that this is an interactive event as well, and that we can get the most out of all of these experts' minds that we've gathered here on a Thursday night. And so I guess I'll start it off with Tucker. And you spoke about this a little bit, but I'm wondering if you can elaborate just a bit about, I hear from a lot of folks that I talk to about concerns about ocean conditions and the role that ocean conditions and pinniped predation play, and this sense that that is a bigger source of mortality than the Snake River dams. And I'm wondering if you can just elaborate on that mortality and putting it in context a little bit, just in the overall sources that exist. I know you did talk about this, but a little bit more elaboration maybe.
Sure, thanks, Betsy. I could try. Yeah, I mean, the ocean will always have a huge influence on salmon and steelhead in the Columbia Basin. It will have a huge influence for salmon and steelhead going out of coastal streams. It is a big influencer, and the ocean, those conditions vary over time. I guess my point is, all of the salmon experience that ocean, right? So you kind of have to take that off the top. And then you start looking at other sources of mortality. Nothing really stacks up against the dam. Everything else, relatively speaking, is such a tiny piece of the overall puzzle. And I know I mentioned this during the talk, but really just looking at the differences between fish that otherwise share, a same experience, right? Those fish are going to have the same sea lions chasing them. They're going to have the same ocean conditions when they hit the estuary plume on their out migration. They're going to face the same fishing pressures in the ocean and in the river. But what some of them don't have to face and what some of them do have to face is the number of dams. And really, every time a fish hits one of those dams, it, as a smolt swimming out of the river, it decreases its opportunity of returning as adult by about 10% every time. So, if you have only 3 dams to pass and you're unfortunate enough to hit 3 dams, you basically reduce your chances of coming back by about 30%. If you have 8 dams to get past and you are unfortunate enough to hit 8 dams, you've reduced your chances of returning by about 80%. And that's, that builds up and it stacks up. So thanks. I think that's what I have for that.
Wow, that's just an incredible tidbit to think that every time a juvenile salmon interacts with a dam, their chance of returning drops by 10%. That's just so shocking. And yeah, salmon that are born in Idaho have to travel through 8 dams.
So Betsy, if I could just take one more second, I think a fun little fact, and the reason why spill has helped and why, part of the reason why spill has helped and why this restoration, could really help is salmon. This is maybe most people don't know this. When they're migrating out as juveniles, they are not facing downstream. They're actually facing upstream, and they're basically a passive particle. They rely on the flow. They rely on the river flow to help them reach the ocean. And so when you stack that up behind dams, and they have to turn then and swim down, they're using up their energy reserves to get there. So having a restored lower river will definitely help. And that's, really one of the mechanisms there that will help that.
Yeah. Well, I guess kind of going back to Jack, I'm curious to hear, you're a longstanding guide on this river, and how do you feel restoring a free-flowing snake would help the guiding community? Like, you talked a lot about your history of involvement in this campaign, and I'm curious kind of what it would mean for guides on the river.
Well, it means a lot for guides, and if we were looking at removal of the Snake River Dam, so there's a whole new guiding industry to open up in that upper reaches, and rafting guides or powerboat guides, tour guides, enjoying the canyon even more. You could flock tours there enormously because of the beauty and scenery that's there now compared to just the reservoir. There's a lot of opportunity to be used right there in the guiding world. But, and I always represent guiding as for all anglers. It's not just these guides. The guides take people in their boats who buy licenses to enjoy that resource. Everybody pays. You pay to play to get out and enjoy that. And then a lot of those people that we have in our boats go out and buy their own boats and gear and enjoy the resource as well. So it's a big picture. It's more than just the fishing guides themselves. Now, there are isolated fisheries where it's very limited scope and how many people can get into these areas. So you're not going to have a lot of guides, but you can certainly have a lot of people come and enjoy those places that are permitted waterways only for certain guides. Deschutes, for an example, that runs into the Columbia River. There's only so many guides are allowed on that watershed, and that needs to happen because it is a small waterway. But the recreational value in that entire Snake River Canyon, that lower basin there, would be enormous. It is already above Clarkston and Lewiston there, upriver of that. They utilize it now. Could imagine down below. Now, there are 3 marinas that would be affected if you drain those dams. I see that, but those marinas could still be used. You just have to have a different type of boat. It would be more of a jet type craft to run down into that waterway because it'd be more like a river system. There's not a lot of commerce exercised up there. Most of the commerce on the Columbia River happens from Pasco, Washington down, and that's those 4 Columbia River dams. Those we're not looking at affecting those, but the Snake River dams, low power generation capability. Irrigators can still pull the water from the dams. They do it on the Rogue River. They pull water out of the waterway with the removal of Savage Rapids and God, I ran a blank for a minute. The other dams that were removed on the Rogue River, they still irrigate that watershed. It can still be done in the Columbia River. The irrigators will get their water. For the guiding industry, sure, it'd be huge all the way through the basin because it's going to allow more fish passage, more survival. The fish will do better. There's no question about that.
Great. Thank you, Jack. And Liz, I'm curious what you have to say. What's different? This campaign has been going on for 20 years. Lots of people have heard about this campaign in the course of their time in the Northwest. And I'm curious, why now? Why now? What's going on now? What's the change?
Well, I'd really like to say it's about the fish and the urgency of their plight and the fact that the science is all settled. Because remember, the fish out of Idaho right now, they are not replacing themselves, not hatchery fish, not wild fish. So clearly that's part of it. Another big driver, though, right now is that these declining runs are starving the southern resident killer whales. And so that has brought the millions of people that live in Puget Sound. That's kind of brought this issue into focus for them as well. And, they are trashing sport, commercial, and tribal fisheries. And we've kind of watched this happen like a slow-moving train wreck. The other thing that's changing is that leadership is starting to step into the void. So for instance, Governor Little of Idaho convened stakeholders to talk about the plight of the returns to Idaho-bound salmon. And there was talk about river restoration there. Governor Inslee set up an Orca task force. And after that, there was a bunch of listening sessions around the region for stakeholders to talk together. And then maybe one of the bigger catalysts lately was a Columbia Basin Partnership, which was a 4-state sovereign and stakeholder process that Tucker and I served on for for 3 years. And we set numeric goals for the fish runs, and we talked about different pathways to get there, built relationships. And out of this partnership, 4 governors signed a historic agreement to work together on this issue and commit to work with the sovereigns and stakeholders and federal agencies to find solutions. So leaders from around the region are leaning in, and they're asking those what if questions. You know, how do we leave behind the us versus them mentality? How do we work on comprehensive solutions and modernize our infrastructure and create jobs and bring salmon along into that prosperity with us? So what's new is this region that's ready for these questions, and I think we're ready for this future. But as important as all of this is, because remember, the science hasn't driven anything and the salmon crisis didn't drive anything. But right now, the Pacific Northwest has the most senior and the most powerful senators and representatives that serve on committees that have influence over salmon and influence over infrastructure. And so this is a magic moment right now where all these things are aligning. Energy prices are dropping. People are tired of false choices. They want solutions. COVID has created the need for stimulus packages and jobs. So that's why, again, your 400,000 voices are so important, because united, this is a powerful conservation point at a powerful moment in history. This is our once in a lifetime chance to make a truly meaningful difference. And I'll shut up. I'm excited. You can tell I am so stoked to be around and have the privilege of working on this issue right now.
That's awesome.
All of you.
Yeah, and building on that, I mean, this is a powerful opportunity, and to make sure it happens, we need to make sure our legislators know that this is something that we want to happen. And so that is where your voice matters. We need all of you. Yes, sign our petition, of course. We would love you to show your support, and that helps us keep you informed about what's happening, but also contact your legislators. We've set up a very easy form for you that's in the chat in terms of an action alert that you can just email your representatives and senators. There's also a click to call that we've put in that NWF setup. That's a very easy app-based type of thing to just call your legislators. They have a script for you and everything. They read it to you, it patches you through, and you just read it back. And so these are the things that we can really do to help our legislators know that this is something we care about. So thank you, Liz, for highlighting that we have a really historic opportunity and we need to seize it. I'm going into the Q&A here just to pull out a couple of questions. And I know we haven't really been focusing on the energy piece of this conversation at all. And there are a couple of different energy piece questions coming through. And so I've brought Brian Brooks in from Idaho Wildlife Federation. He's our affiliate over in Idaho and is been on the salmon work group with Brad Little, the governor's work group. He is all things salmon. And so I'm curious, Brian, if you can just elaborate on there's a number of questions coming in through the chat about power replacement type of questions, like where can we offset this power, whether it's nuclear, other things like that. And so curious what your insight is there.
Yeah, I think before we get into how we can replace the power currently provided by the lower Snake River dams, I think it's first really important to understand how much power the Snake River dams actually contribute to Bonneville Power's entire generation portfolio. I believe there's 31 power projects that Bonneville Power operates, and these were first started because of the New Deal to provide jobs, provide cheap wholesale power to the Pacific Northwest. And they just kept building and building and building. And by the time they built the 4 lower Snake River dams, there was more supply than there was demand, which drove the price very low. And that necessitated this Northwest Power and Planning Act of 1980. Congress had to step in essentially because BPA was not financially solvent. The last projects that they built, some of the last projects at least, were the lower 4 Snake River dams. The 4 dams put together contribute about 4 to 5% of all of BPA's power portfolio. So these are some of the lowest capacity power generating projects that BPA has. And so to say that these are essential to BPA's power generation is really an exaggeration, especially because since these dams the last one was completed, Lower Granite, sometime in the early 1970s, we've had the onlining of other hydro projects. We've had natural gas, solar, wind. We've actually surpassed the energy capacity that these projects provide. And so even if we remove them, that power is already kind of made up. But there is a value to these dams, and that is the base load power. Basically, when we are turning on and that's really important to recognize, I think. We wouldn't be being honest with ourselves if we didn't say that out loud. But the thing is when we are powering our ACs in peak summer heat, or when we're powering our electric heaters in the winter, you can flip a switch at the dams and that power can be supplied immediately. That is the sole value of these dams, but that base load can be replaced. And there are many ways that we have invented in the last 50 years, as you can imagine. This is pretty outdated technology. And one of those that we're actually looking at, and I saw another question that was asked, is what role might nuclear power play in the future? And that is actually a really developing technology as far as modular nuclear reactors, which are very small. They're about the size of a small bus or a Volkswagen, and they can power several thousands of homes, and they're really safe and they're contained. And that's the same. They do the same thing that a dam can provide. If we need that baseload power, we can just flip the switch, and we can get our power when we need it, and it's not causing and it's not solely responsible for an extinction. There are still some concerns with how we dispose of nuclear waste, but this is a lot safer option, and it's not the only way that we can upload some baseline power there as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. I guess while we have you, a number of other comments have come in on the chat, just asking about what's going on in Idaho. I mean, we don't have any Idaho folks like on the panel in terms of what we were talking about, and so there's clearly a huge Idaho stake, and I'm wondering if you can elaborate on just the groups involved in this campaign over in Idaho.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of groups that are working on this. The Idaho Wildlife Federation, the organization that I head up, is it's a hook and bullet organization. And so we kind of represent the sportsman constituency. And I think because of that, our closest partners are with Trout Unlimited and the Idaho Outfitters and Guides Association, and another organization that popped up called the Idaho River Community Alliance, which really advocates for these rural riverside communities that really rely on the industry provided by these fish. And that's not just for outfitters and guides, that's for hotels, restaurants, coffee shops, you name it. And then of course there are other partners like Idaho Rivers United, Idaho Conservation League, the Native American tribes, of course. And there are a lot of people that are really interested in this, and Idaho is advocating. In fact, so the representative that is sort of leading the charge and putting a fire under some butts in Congress is Representative Simpson. That is a Republican from a very conservative state. And that means a lot when somebody like that is willing to stick their neck out for an environmental issue. And so, and Simpson is where he is politically on this issue because these communities have spoken out, and these communities are being mobilized and energized in large part because of the work and advocacy being done by the organizations in Idaho. It's a different campaign than it was 20 years ago. The conversations are happening more quietly behind the scenes, talking about the practicality of really propping up the status quo, how that isn't working. And that's not something that really, it's a nuanced conversation. It's not something that happens very well over social media and out loud and in the press, because that's when you start getting those public conversations, that's where people just butt heads. That's where people say flagrant misinformation, and a lot of the better conversations that are factual are happening quietly behind the scenes. So anybody who's wondering where Idaho is, we're doing it, and we're doing it behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, another theme that keeps coming up in the chat and in the questions is hatcheries. And Liz, I'm wondering if you can kind of elaborate on why we can't just put more hatchery fish in the river, why that isn't necessarily going to solve this problem of low declining trends.
Yeah, I'd be happy to address that. That one's so easy. And then there's some other questions I think in the chat that are really troubling to the community, the sport fishing community. First of all, I would just say that anybody who does investments and you've got your money packed away in an investment that brings you back less than $1 for every dollar you put in, for every $2 you put in, you'd be questioning that investment. When we restore the Snake River Dam, we can double and then triple what we have invested in hatchery fish right now. And so we can either choose to put more money into an investment with a crappy return, or we could start making the money we have invested now working for us by restoring the river. So that's one thing I would say about hatchery funding, even though we have spent, 30 years working on funding hatcheries and keeping them funded. So that's an important thing, but we want those investments to pencil out for folks. The other question was, someone asked if dams were going to be removed, if that would affect hatchery production. And I believe that's another one of those voices of false choices. The hatchery system that is in place by and large because of the 4 main stem dams and because of the Snake River Compensation Plan. And so at least in the partnership, we had no conversations about reducing hatchery production unless it was directly tied with numbers of wild fish returning that were harvestable. So, so I think the boogeyman of hatcheries and dam removal is just another one of those false choices out there.
Another question that's coming in kind of along that line of like infrastructure is, and I'll leave this up to the panel to decide who wants to answer it, but fish ladders. Can we solve the problem with fish ladders? Looks like Brian is interested.
This as along with someone else who made a comment in the chat, Richard Scully, I was also on the governor's work group, and we got a lot of questions about this. Why if we have fish ladders isn't this working? And the answer, really the best answer is that fish ladders are for adult returning fish. The major killer of the hydro system is when fish are smolts, when we talked about these little baby fish that are being used to get flushed to the ocean in a matter of days, are now having to swim around these very long lakes, these reservoirs. And it's the water transport time, it's the powerhouse interactions, it's the invasive species, both fish like walleye and bass. So we're subsidizing this great walleye fishery. And then it's also avian predation as well. And so the fish ladders don't help that smolt mortality. And by Bonneville Power's own numbers, the hydro system is responsible for over 50% mortality of Idaho's fish. So we release about 20 million to 21 million salmon and Chinook and steelhead a year from our hatcheries. About 11 million of them are wiped out before they ever get to the saltwater.
And then Brian, on top of that, right, even the returning adults that do make it over the 4 dams, only about 2% of those are actually going to be able to spawn. And so those wild fish are even just more greatly affected by their downriver movement once those smolts actually start hatching.
Yeah, and
so this is Tucker. Can I just also chime in here? They do have these juvenile bypass systems at these dams. But I don't think people really understand like the mechanistic, like convoluted, tortured fix that kind of is. For a juvenile salmon to hit one of these juvenile bypasses, as it approaches a dam, it has to sound down about 100 feet, right? Swim down 100 feet. It hits a screen that keeps it from going into the turbine. Then it has to come back up in a concrete slot about 100 feet. And these are called gate wells. When it gets to the top of the gate well, it is flushed through an orifice about 10 to 12 inches wide that looks like a fire hose. And after it flushes through that, it starts its long winding track down, what looks like a corrugated metal version of a water slide at a water park. Complete sometimes even with corkscrews in them to keep them there, where they splash out across metal separator bars before either being put in a barge or sent back down to the river. So, it's not, I guess, unusual or odd to me that might be a stressful event that might decrease your chances of survival later on.
Yeah, Buzz Ramsey used to call those techno fixes.
That's a funny one. I'll have to steal that from Buzz.
They used to do barging too. I think they still do a little of that, barging and trucking of juvenile fish downriver. And I actually observed trucks that came down from the upper reaches. They drive these trucks down, put them on a little barge below Bonneville. They drive them out in the middle of the river, and then they pull the lever on the truck. Now that water's been cooled at 38 to 42 degrees to keep them alive during that drive through Eastern Oregon or Washington, to bring them down in a matter of 5 hours instead of taking them 2 months to get their way down naturally. And they'd spill them into the Columbia River below Bonneville where it's 70 degrees. And I watched those juvenile fish jump out of the water because they're shocked by the warm water. And then the seagulls dive in and start eating them like crazy. And so when I was at Capitol Hill, I took a picture of this and gave it to the Corps of Engineers General, the head guy of the Corps of Engineers. And I asked him, why don't we release these fish out of these trucks at night? At least the birds would not harvest them so heavily. And he says, my staff will get back to you. 2 weeks later, I get an email from him. And the comment was, they would have to pay the drivers overtime.
Wow.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. I got pictures of seagulls eating those juvenile fish when they were transferred. Also in barges, when they transferred fish, they transferred all species of fish. They had crappie, they had bluegill, they had some trout, walleye, salmon, odds. Everything would go through when they run these barges. And they had some kill off those barges too because of the warm water. So the techno fixes were not the answer.
Right. Well, and on that note, that's about time. The techno fixes, it's time that we need a real fix. And the real fix comes with contacting your legislator. So please, everyone, do that. That's if I could get one thing for my birthday next week, it's that you would call your legislator and ask them to take the Snake River dams down. So please do that for me and for your future fishing opportunities and for the future of taking your grandchildren fishing on the river. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for putting questions in the chat and engaging with each other in the chat. So, and thank you to all of our wonderful panelists. I really appreciate you and you dedicating a Thursday night to come out and speak with us. So I guess we end it. I don't know.